The house had always felt like a strange comfort, its worn wooden floors creaking with each step, and the walls seemed to hold stories of those who lived here before. Emily had recently moved into the old Victorian house, a place that had once belonged to a family who had long since left. The house felt lonely yet familiar, as if it was waiting for her. The soft whispers of the wind outside seemed to echo inside the walls, a constant reminder of the quiet solitude. But it wasn't just the wind that seemed to whisper. Emily had found the letters in a dusty, forgotten drawer of the old writing desk in the attic. She hadn't been expecting anything more than a few old receipts or family documents left behind. But the letters, stacked neatly, tied with a faded ribbon, were not just any letters. They were love letters, carefully written in delicate cursive on thick, yellowed paper. Each one was addressed to a name Emily had never heard of before. Margaret. Curiosity gnawed at her, and one night, with a glass of wine in her hand, she began to read. The first letter was simple but heartfelt. My dearest Margaret, every moment spent apart from you feels like an eternity. I cannot wait until I can hold you again. Until then, my heart beats for you alone. The letters were full of passion, longing, and the kind of love that Emily could only dream of. As she read the words, she felt an unsettling mix of awe and discomfort. The love expressed in these letters was so raw, so intense, almost obsessive. As she moved through the letters, she began to feel an odd sense of connection to this Margaret. The letters were so personal, so intimate, that it almost felt like the writer, this mysterious person, was speaking directly to her. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, as though the writer's emotions were somehow pouring out through the ink, directly into her own heart. But then, as she flipped through another letter, her eyes widened in shock. Dearest Margaret, I know you can hear me. I feel you watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to acknowledge you. I can feel your presence even when I am alone. Do you think I won't find out the truth? I know you're still here. You're closer than ever. The words struck her like a cold wave. Emily sat back, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the air around her grow heavier, colder. She tried to shake the feeling off, blaming it on the late hour and her overactive imagination. But when she read the next letter, the unease in her stomach only deepened. Margaret, why haven't you left yet? I can hear you, you know. You think I don't know you're hiding in the walls? Watching me when I sleep? I feel your eyes on me, your cold breath against my neck. Don't think I haven't noticed. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the stillness of the house. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the rustling of the curtains as the wind blew through the open window. Everything seemed unnaturally quiet. Then the sound came again, a faint scraping noise from the walls. Emily froze. Her skin crawled as she listened, her eyes darting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The scraping continued, like nails dragging across the plaster, soft but persistent. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to believe it, but the sound was undeniable. Something was moving inside the walls. She quickly closed the letters, her hands trembling. What had she stumbled upon? The house had always been quiet, peaceful, yet now it felt suffocating. Was it just the old house settling? Or was there something more to these letters than she was willing to admit? The scraping noise stopped, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. She sat there, frozen in place, her eyes wide, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But then, as she began to convince herself it was all in her head, she heard a soft voice. It was barely a whisper, but it sent chills down her spine. Emily. Her name was barely audible, but it was clear enough for her to hear it. She shot up from the chair, knocking over the glass of wine in her haste. Her eyes scanned the room, but no one was there. And yet, that voice, it had come from somewhere close. Suddenly, she realized something she hadn't before. The letters, they weren't just from some long-forgotten lover. They were from someone who knew her name, someone who had been watching her long before she moved into this house. The truth was clear now. The writer of the letters wasn't some distant memory. They were still out there, and they were watching her. The sound of footsteps echoed from above. She could hear them, slow and deliberate, each one coming closer. She rushed to the door, her mind racing. Was she alone in the house? Was there someone upstairs? As her hand gripped the doorknob, she heard the voice again. But this time it was louder, more urgent. Emily, a chill ran down her spine. She flung the door open, but when she stepped into the hallway, there was no one there. The footsteps continued, now coming from the attic. Her heart raced. She had to know what was up there. She had to know who was haunting her. With a trembling hand, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly ascended the stairs, her breath shallow in her chest. Each step seemed to creak louder than the last, echoing in the silence. As she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The door to the attic was ajar, just a sliver, as if inviting her in. She pushed it open. The attic was dark, except for the beam of her flashlight, which barely illuminated the far corners. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of years of neglect. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stepped inside. And then, in the farthest corner, she saw it. A figure standing still, watching her, her breath caught in her throat. It was a shadowy figure, barely discernible, with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. It was the figure from the letters, and it was waiting for her. Emily's heart raced as the figure in the attic stood frozen in place, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The flashlight trembled in her hand, casting erratic beams across the room, but it did nothing to diminish the chilling presence before her. The attic, once a place of dust and forgotten memories, now felt like the very core of her nightmare. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating her with an unnatural heaviness. The figure did not move, simply stood there watching her. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the rest of the world. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead, unwilling to obey her commands. The attic was silent, save for the faint thud of her heartbeat and the low hum of her breath. Then, suddenly, a soft rustle, barely audible, came from the corner of the attic. The figure moved slightly, but not enough to show a clear shape. It was more like the shadows themselves were shifting, molding around it. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as the dark shape seemed to grow, its form becoming more defined with each passing second. "Who are you?" Emily's voice barely escaped her throat, her words trembling like a leaf in the wind. No response. The figure's eyes never left her, and a faint whisper of a sound seemed to seep through the silence. A sound that almost felt like a sigh. The air around her grew colder, and Emily instinctively pulled her coat tighter around her. But it did nothing to stave off the growing sense of terror that clawed at her chest. She took a tentative step back, her feet dragging as if they were caught in some invisible force. The floor creaked beneath her, a loud, mocking sound that broke the stillness of the moment. Her hand tightened around the flashlight, and with a shaking breath, she took another step backward. She had to get out of there. The beam of light flickered in her hand, casting strange shadows across the attic. It was like the darkness itself was alive, clinging to the walls, threatening to swallow her whole. The beam darted across the attic, landing on the corners, the forgotten relics of past lives. Old trunks, wooden boxes, and furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets. She turned to leave, but the moment she shifted, the figure moved. It was swift, so much faster than she could have anticipated. In the blink of an eye, it closed the distance between them, standing directly in her path. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked with the glowing ones. The room seemed to spin as the figure's form became clearer, and Emily felt as if she was being pulled into the very depths of those eyes, dark, endless, and empty. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The air was thick, suffocating. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill her chest, her mind spiraling with thoughts of what was happening, what it was, and why it was here. Then it spoke. Emily. The voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it pierced the stillness like a knife. The way it said her name, soft, almost affectionate, made her blood run cold. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and her pulse hammered in her ears. "How do you know my name?" Emily's voice trembled, a combination of fear and disbelief. The figure did not respond. Instead, its eyes glowed brighter, and Emily's surroundings seemed to blur, like her very reality was shifting, slipping out of her control. A dark mist began to form around her, swirling like a storm, drawing closer and closer until she felt suffocated by it. "Leave me alone," she shouted, finally finding her voice, her panic rising like an uncontrollable wave. The figure did not flinch. Instead, its presence seemed to grow, as if it had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface of the house's history. The darkness around her pulsed, like it had a life of its own, feeding off her fear. She backed up again, and this time the figure didn't move to block her. But the heavy air that surrounded her made each step feel like a battle. She stumbled toward the attic stairs, but as she turned to flee, she heard the voice again, this time louder, more insistent. "Emily." This time it wasn't a whisper, it was a demand. A command that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. She froze. The air felt like ice now, and it seemed to press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The room felt impossibly cold, the temperature dropping so quickly that her breath became visible in the thick air. The house groaned under the weight of the silence. For a moment, Emily wondered if she was losing her mind. Maybe the letters had finally driven her to madness. But as she looked back toward the figure, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The faint glow in its eyes flickered, and something else seemed to stir beneath the surface. A reflection, a movement, a face that she recognized. It was hers. Her stomach turned, bile rising in her throat as she stumbled backward, her hand gripping the banister to steady herself. The figure was not just watching her, it was mimicking her. The eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, now stared at her with an unsettling familiarity. "It knows me." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The love letters, the strange feeling that she was being watched. None of it was a coincidence. The figure in the attic, the one who had written those letters, had been here before her. But more than that, it was connected to her. She turned and ran down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure did not follow, but she could feel its presence still lingering in the house, suffocating her with its unrelenting gaze. When she reached the living room, Emily did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the stack of letters, still lying on the coffee table where she had left them. She flipped through them in a panic, her eyes scanning for answers, something to explain what was happening. And then she saw it. The last letter, the one she had almost missed. It was different from the others. It wasn't a love letter. It was something darker, more desperate. "I know you'll read this, Margaret. You always do. But I won't wait forever. If you don't come to me, I'll come to you. You can't hide from me. Not now, not ever. The handwriting, once so delicate, now looked erratic, as if written in haste, in fear. The words danced on the page, like the ink had been smeared by trembling hands. Margaret, Emily whispered to herself. The name was the same as in the letters, but it wasn't her own. Who was Margaret? Why was this person obsessed with her? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The door behind her creaked open, and then she heard it, a whisper, so faint she almost couldn't hear it. Emily. The footsteps outside the living room door stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Emily stood frozen, her heart thudding painfully in her chest as she clutched the stack of letters to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to escape, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The darkness in the house felt all-encompassing, like it was suffocating her from all sides. Who was out there? The door creaked open slowly, as if the intruder were testing her, savoring her fear. Emily's eyes darted toward the door, her gaze narrowing in the dim light. A figure stood in the threshold, silhouetted against the darkness of the hallway, its shape indistinct and wavering like smoke. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in as the air grew colder. She could see nothing beyond the figure's outline, but she could feel its presence. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, it just watched. Who's there? Emily's voice cracked as she tried to summon the courage to speak. Her throat felt tight, as if the words were lodged there, unwilling to leave. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. What do you want? The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its outline sharpening as it approached her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't see the face, only the outline of a figure, long and slender, moving closer, its presence growing stronger with each step. She took a step back, her hand reaching for the edge of the table as her breath quickened. Please, stay away, she whispered, almost to herself. The figure stopped just a few feet from her, and for a moment, everything was still. The air was so thick, so heavy, that it felt like time had stopped. Emily could barely hear her own heartbeat over the deafening silence. She could feel the coldness of the figure's presence, seeping into her skin, freezing her in place. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure moved again. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Emily froze, her mind racing as she fought the urge to scream. She couldn't make out the details of the figure's face, but she could see something that made her blood run cold. The faintest glow, like an ember, flickered beneath the surface of the darkness, and then it became clearer. The face, her face. It was a reflection of her own face, but not in the mirror, not in the usual way. It was distorted, twisted, as if the figure had taken her likeness and turned it into something monstrous. The eyes were wide, glowing, vacant. The lips stretched into an eerie, silent smile that was both familiar and wrong. No, it can't be. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she took another step back, her body trembling with fear. The figure's lips didn't move, but she could feel its voice crawling into her mind, whispering in the back of her skull. The words were faint, like a distant memory that couldn't quite be grasped. Emily. The voice was so soft, so intimate, that it sent a shiver down her spine. But as it reached her ears, something shifted in her chest, something that felt cold and heavy. It was the same voice she had heard in the attic, the same voice that had whispered her name when she stood in the darkness. The figure's hand slowly reached out toward her, the fingers long and thin, stretched unnaturally. Emily took another step back, her hand grasping the edge of the table tightly, but the movement of the figure seemed to draw her in. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't look away. "It knows me." The realization hit her like a tidal wave. This figure, this thing in front of her, wasn't just a stranger. It wasn't just some apparition or ghostly figure. No, it was something more. It was a part of her, and it had been here long before she ever set foot in this house. The letters, the strange presence, the feeling that she was being watched. It all made sense now. The figure was connected to her, to the house, to the forgotten lover from the past. And now it was here in the present trying to claim her. Emily's eyes locked with the figures, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of recognition in its glowing gaze. A flicker of something that felt both intimate and terrifying. It knew her. It had always known her. Before she could react, the figure's hand shot forward, faster than she could comprehend. Her scream was swallowed by the thick air as the cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, pulling her closer to it. The grip was icy, sending a shock of terror through her body. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice hoarse with panic. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, its coldness seeping into her bones, making it impossible to break free. In the struggle, Emily's flashlight fell from her hand, rolling across the floor and casting strange, flickering shadows across the room. The figure's face, that twisted reflection of her own, was inches from hers now. She could feel the cold breath of the creature on her skin, could see the vacant eyes staring into hers, filled with an unspoken hunger. Suddenly, the figure's voice broke through the suffocating silence again, this time louder, more forceful. "You can't hide from me, Emily." The words were not just a whisper now. They were a command, a declaration of power. Emily's heart raced as the grip on her wrist tightened, and she felt herself being pulled closer to the figure, unable to resist its strength. "This is it. This is what the letters warned me about." Her thoughts were a blur of terror and confusion, but one thought stood out above all others. She had to escape. With everything she had, Emily jerked her arm free from the figure's grasp. The motion was wild, fueled by desperation, and it worked. For a moment, the figure hesitated, just long enough for her to break free. She didn't waste a second. With her heart pounding in her chest, she turned and bolted for the front door. The figure didn't chase her, but its presence hung heavy in the air, like a suffocating cloud that threatened to pull her back into the darkness. The door slammed open, and Emily didn't stop running. She didn't look back. She could still feel the figure's eyes on her, but she couldn't afford to slow down. She ran out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and her legs ached from the panic-fueled sprint. But she didn't stop. As she reached the end of the driveway, she turned to look back at the house. The lights were all out, and the house stood silent, dark, and imposing in the night. But she could feel it, the presence, the watchful eyes. She wasn't alone. And in that moment, Emily realized something even more terrifying than the figure in the house. The house itself was alive. Emily sat on the porch of her new home, clutching her knees to her chest, her eyes scanning the horizon. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still trapped in the nightmare she had just escaped, the memory of the twisted figure in the house haunting her every thought. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow as she tried to steady herself. What had she gotten herself into? She had fled the house, but it felt as though the house had never truly let her go. The dark presence, that thing in the shadows, followed her, lingering in her mind, creeping into her thoughts at every turn. It felt like a living, breathing entity that was determined to claim her. She could still feel the cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, the eerie reflection of her own face twisted into something malevolent. The letters, they were the key, weren't they? The forgotten lover from the past had never really left. The house was more than just a building. It was a prison, holding something far worse than she could imagine. She hadn't opened the last letter yet, the one that had been tucked away, hidden in the bottom of the stack. The one that had been written in a frantic, desperate scrawl. She had avoided it, but now, with the night closing in around her and the shadows growing longer, she knew it was time to face it. Emily stood up, her legs shaky, and made her way back into the house. The door creaked open with an unsettling sound, and she winced as it echoed through the silence. The house felt different now, darker, heavier, as though it had been waiting for her return. As she stepped inside, she could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her. She walked slowly to the table where the letters were spread out. Her hand hovered over the final letter, the one that had haunted her since the moment she saw it. It felt cursed, like opening it would unleash something that had been locked away for far too long. Taking a deep breath, Emily picked up the letter, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. The handwriting was sloppy, frantic, as though the writer had been in a state of panic when they wrote it. The ink was smeared in places, as if tears had fallen onto the paper. To whoever finds this letter, I am sorry. I never meant for this to happen. But you must understand, I didn't want to be forgotten. Couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand the thought of fading into nothingness. I have waited for so long, and I will wait for as long as it takes. He won't stop until he finds me. He never stops. Please, for your own safety, leave this place. Leave before it's too late. The house is alive and it remembers. It remembers everything. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. Her hands began to shake, the letter slipping from her fingers as a cold gust of wind swept through the room, causing the lights to flicker. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, trying to process the words. The house is alive. She had thought it was just a metaphor, a way to explain the strange, unsettling feeling she had whenever she was inside. But now, reading those words, she knew it was something more. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had been waiting for her. Emily dropped to her knees, her mind racing. Who had written this letter? The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words felt too personal, too intimate. It was like the person knew her, knew exactly what she was going through. But how? Suddenly, there was a noise, soft at first, like a whisper in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. A voice, the same voice she had heard in the house, the one that had whispered her name. Emily. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. Emily, I'm waiting. Her heart raced as she stood up, panic flooding her veins. She looked around the room, but there was no one there. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing inward, the air thick and suffocating. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty house. I'm here, Emily. I've always been here. Without thinking, Emily grabbed the flashlight from the table and turned it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. She stepped cautiously toward the staircase, her footsteps tentative as she moved through the silent house. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded deafening in the quiet, and the air seemed to hum with an eerie energy. She reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. There, standing at the top of the staircase, was the figure. It was no longer just a shadow. It had a shape now, a form that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. The same figure she had seen before, the one with glowing eyes and that twisted, distorted reflection of her own face. It was standing there, watching her, Her body went cold with fear, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in the gaze of the figure. Its eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, as though it was waiting for something only she could give. "Emily," the voice came again, soft and chilling. "I never left. I'm waiting for you to remember." The figure took a step forward, and Emily's heart leapt into her throat. The air seemed to crackle with a strange energy, as if something in the house had come alive, something ancient and malevolent. "Remember?" Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning of the words. She didn't understand. What was she supposed to remember? The figure stepped forward again, closer this time. Emily stumbled back, her hands reaching out for anything to hold onto. She grabbed the railing, but it was slick with cold, like it had been drenched in ice. She could feel the temperature dropping, the room growing colder by the second. Suddenly, a loud crash rang through the house, a noise so deafening that Emily cried out in shock. She spun around, her flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. The figure had vanished. What was happening? The house seemed to groan and creak as if it were alive, as if it was breathing, shifting, moving around her. She could feel its presence, its hunger. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the floor beneath her feet felt like it was giving way. With no other choice, Emily turned and ran. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to get out of there. She had to leave before whatever it was that haunted the house claimed her. She raced toward the door, but when she reached it, her hand froze on the handle. The door was locked, bolted shut from the inside. Panic surged through her chest as she pulled on the handle, but it didn't budge. "No, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let me out." She turned around, her heart pounding as she searched the room for any other way to escape. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick with the sound of her frantic breaths. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting into grotesque shapes. She wasn't alone. The voice came again, louder this time, filling the room with its oppressive presence. "Emily, you can't escape." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stood there, paralyzed by fear, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't alone, and whatever was in the house was coming for her. Emily's heart raced as the darkness pressed in around her. The cold, oppressive silence was shattered only by the frantic beat of her own pulse in her ears. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, her breath shallow, her hands clammy as she gripped the flashlight. It flickered in her hand, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls, the air so still it was suffocating. "The house is alive." The words echoed in her mind, a chilling mantra that she couldn't escape. She had felt the weight of the house before, but now it was as though the very structure itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The walls creaked, the floor groaned beneath her feet, and the whispering voice that had tormented her since she first set foot in this place was louder now, more demanding. "Emily!" It came from everywhere and nowhere, a soft murmur that seemed to coil around her, filling the space like a thick fog. Her skin prickled with dread, but she couldn't stop herself from turning toward the source of the sound. A figure, the same one that had haunted her dreams, stood in the doorway. Its outline was blurry, almost unreal, like a distortion in the air. But there was something undeniably human about it, something that made Emily's stomach twist with terror. She could barely see its face, just two dark, glowing eyes staring back at her, reflecting an emptiness that sent a shiver crawling down her spine. "I've been waiting for you, Emily," the voice whispered again, this time deeper, more guttural. It felt like the very air around her had thickened, choking off any hope of escape. Her pulse hammered in her throat, and for a moment, her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure. It felt like it was drawing her in, pulling her closer with an invisible force. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place. The figure took a step forward, the sound of its feet dragging across the floor sending a shiver through her. It didn't walk like a person. It moved like something that didn't belong to the world of the living. The air grew colder with each movement, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Emily's hand tightened on the flashlight, and with a burst of adrenaline, she took a step back, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as she stumbled away. The figure didn't move, but the presence of it was overwhelming, filling every inch of the room. What is it? The thought raced through her mind like a lightning bolt. She knew she had to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked, the windows were sealed shut, and the figure, it was coming closer. "Don't be afraid, Emily." The voice came again, soft, soothing, but there was an underlying malice in it, a cruelty that made Emily's skin crawl. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. She could feel the temperature dropping with every passing second, the very air thick with the weight of its malevolent energy. "I can't stay here." The thought was crystal clear, but her body refused to obey. She wanted to run, to scream, to tear herself away from this nightmare, but the terror had her in its grip, and the more she tried to fight, the harder it became to breathe. "You've read the letters, haven't you?" the voice asked, its tone almost casual now, as if they were having a normal conversation. "You know why I'm here, Emily? You know what I want." She couldn't answer. She didn't know what it wanted. She didn't understand any of this. But she did know one thing. It wasn't human. It wasn't something she could fight or reason with. It was an entity born from the depths of the house, tied to the very foundation of the building, and it wouldn't let her go. With shaking hands, Emily grabbed at her coat, as if the mere act of touching something familiar would ground her, remind her of who she was. The house groaned, a low, menacing sound, as though the very walls were listening, waiting for her to make the next move. "You've been chosen," the figure continued, its voice like a dark lullaby, soothing yet horrifying. "I've been waiting for someone like you, Emily, someone who could understand." The words were unsettling, but the terror of what it might mean began to crystallize in her mind. This thing had been waiting for her, for years, maybe even longer than that. It had chosen her as its next victim, the next person to take part in whatever twisted ritual it had planned. She was a pawn in something much larger than she could comprehend. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. "Do you feel it, Emily? The house. It remembers you. It has always remembered you." Suddenly, the air shifted, and Emily could feel the room pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in time with her racing heart. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting around her, clawing at her skin. The walls were no longer just walls. They felt like they were closing in, inching forward with each breath she took. "No, no," Emily gasped, stumbling backward. She couldn't breathe. The walls were too close. The darkness was too thick. She spun around, her eyes frantically searching for an escape. There was no way out. There was no way to run. The door, the windows, everything was locked, sealed shut. She was trapped. The figure stepped closer, its footfalls heavy and slow, dragging across the floor. "It's too late for you, Emily," it whispered. "You'll never leave this place. You'll never escape me." The words felt like a weight on her chest, crushing her, suffocating her. She was drowning in the darkness, in the cold, in the overwhelming presence of the thing in front of her. And as the figure reached out its hand, its fingers long and twisted, Emily's vision began to blur, the world around her spinning into an abyss. Then, just as it seemed like the darkness would consume her, she heard something, a sound, a knock. It was faint at first, like a tap against the window, but it was there, a soft, rhythmic knocking. She spun toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time, and with it came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Emily, I'm here to help." The voice was different now. It was calm, reassuring, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Emily's heart leapt in her chest, and without thinking, she rushed toward the window, her fingers fumbling with the lock. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that whoever or whatever was on the other side was her only chance. The window creaked open, and a cold gust of wind rushed in. But before she could look outside, she heard the figure behind her, its voice now a low growl. "You think you can escape? You think you can run?" But Emily didn't look back. She stepped out onto the balcony, her eyes scanning the night, searching for the source of the voice. And then she saw it, a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the forest, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was a person, someone she didn't recognize, but they were standing there watching her. "I'm here, Emily. It's not over. You can still fight." But before she could respond, the figure in the house, the entity, lunged at her, its long fingers stretching toward her. The air grew thick, heavy with the sense of doom. And then, everything went black. The air around Emily was thick with terror. It pressed against her chest like an iron weight, making every breath feel like a struggle. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening, what had happened. One moment, she had been on the balcony, hoping for help. The next, darkness. She could still feel the lingering sensation of cold fingers brushing against her skin, the sharp, desperate pull of something trying to drag her back into the suffocating void. But now she was somewhere else. Her eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was a blur. She could feel the rough surface of the ground beneath her, the cold biting at her skin. The faintest light flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. Her head ached. Everything ached. She tried to push herself up, but the sudden movement sent waves of nausea crashing through her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her surroundings seemed impossibly dark. The light that flickered in the distance didn't seem to come from any particular source, just an eerie, unnatural glow that illuminated the edges of what looked like a hallway. It was narrow, and the walls were damp, the air filled with the musty scent of decay. She could hear the soft scurrying of rats, their tiny claws scratching against the walls. But it wasn't the rodents that made her blood run cold. It was the feeling that she wasn't alone, the sensation that someone or something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. It's happening again. The thought crossed her mind, but she refused to believe it. She couldn't let herself believe it. With effort, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky, unsteady. Every movement felt like it required an enormous amount of strength, like the weight of the world was bearing down on her shoulders. But she couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in the dark in this place. She had to find her way out. The dim light ahead seemed to beckon, a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. It was all she had. As she stumbled forward, her hands brushing against the wet walls, she began to realize that the hallway seemed endless. It stretched on for what felt like miles, the glow in the distance growing brighter. But somehow it never seemed to get any closer. The walls shifted as if alive, closing in around her. Then a noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was coming toward her. Her heart leaped into her throat as she froze, straining her ears to catch the sound. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls like the ticking of a clock. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was coming, and the sound of their approach made her blood run cold. Run. The voice in her mind was sharp, urgent. She didn't need to be told twice. Her legs finally found the strength to move, and she broke into a run, her footsteps slamming against the floor, desperate and frantic. But no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps seemed to follow her, keeping pace with her every move. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. The walls closed in tighter, the air growing staler with every passing second. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she pushed herself harder, trying to escape the nightmare she had walked into. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She let out a strangled cry as she fell, the world spinning wildly as she tumbled down a steep incline. The jagged edges of the floor scraped at her skin, tearing at her clothes as she landed with a hard thud at the bottom. Her vision swam, and for a moment, everything was a blur. When she finally managed to sit up, she gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The room she found herself in was unlike anything she had seen before. It was vast, an enormous, cathedral-like chamber. The walls were lined with old, dusty bookshelves, their contents covered in a thick layer of grime. In the center of the room, a large, ornate mirror stood, its surface cracked and covered with dust. Emily stood, slowly, her body aching from the fall. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. It was too quiet, too still, as though the entire house had fallen silent, holding its breath. What is this place? She looked around, trying to make sense of the room. The floor beneath her was cold, made of stone, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something else. A sickly sweet scent that made her stomach churn. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ancient runes that she couldn't understand. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly glow, as though they were alive. And then her gaze fell on the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was distorted, warped. Her own face looked strange, as if someone had taken her image and twisted it into something grotesque. Her hair was matted, her skin pale, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just her face in the mirror. Behind her, standing just out of sight, was a figure, a shadowy outline that was just barely visible. The same figure she had seen before, the one that had haunted her dreams, that had followed her from the attic, from the house, from the past. Emily's heart slammed in her chest, and she turned, but the figure was gone. She was alone again, but the terror didn't fade. It intensified. "You're not alone, Emily." The voice was soft, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was familiar, too familiar. The same voice that had whispered her name before, the one that had followed her, taunted her. But this time it was different. This time the voice wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the mirror. Emily's eyes went wide as she stepped forward, her legs trembling beneath her. The figure in the reflection was smiling now, its face twisted in a grotesque, sinister grin. "You've been chosen, Emily. You've always been mine." Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, horrified. She turned, searching for an escape, but the room seemed to be closing in on her, the walls shifting and narrowing. The mirror, no, the thing in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive, reaching toward her. In a panic, Emily turned and ran. She ran blindly, not caring where she was going, only that she had to get away. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape. The room stretched out endlessly before her, and the mirror's reflection, the smiling figure, followed her, taunting her with every step. Then, the floor beneath her cracked open. The darkness swallowed her whole. Emily's world was spinning. She couldn't make sense of where she was, how she got here, or why the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Her body felt weightless, like she was floating, and yet, the sense of fear was so suffocating, so real, that it gripped her chest like a vice. Her mind raced as she fought against the crushing darkness that threatened to consume her whole. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance, small but undeniable, the faintest glow, like the light at the end of a tunnel. She strained her eyes, focusing on it, desperate for any sign of hope. She reached out, her hands trembling, and began to move toward it. The further she walked, the more she felt her body solidifying again, the air becoming thicker, the weight of the world returning. The light grew brighter the closer she got, and Emily's heart began to beat faster. She wasn't sure if it was her hope or her fear driving her forward, but she couldn't stop now. Finally, she reached the source of the light. It wasn't a tunnel or an exit, it was a door, a wooden, weathered door that stood out against the endless void, as though it had no business being here. The edges were worn, chipped, as if it had been here for centuries. But there was something unnervingly familiar about it. The door beckoned her. Without thinking, Emily's hand shot out and grasped the cold handle. She didn't hesitate, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn and run. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The sound of it creaking on its hinges was enough to make her shiver. What she saw on the other side was more than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't another dark room or hallway. It wasn't even an ordinary place. It was an attic, the same attic she had stood in before. Her heart dropped as recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. But this attic wasn't the same as the one she'd seen earlier. It was darker, more oppressive, with strange shadows clinging to every corner. The air felt thick with the weight of memories, the kind that linger and never let go. As she stepped inside, the floorboards creaked beneath her weight. A sudden chill ran up her spine. She looked around the attic, her eyes landing on an old, dusty chest near the far wall. The same chest she had seen in her dreams. The chest that had haunted her thoughts for days now. And then, as if on cue, a voice broke through the silence. Emily, her name echoed in the room, soft but unmistakable. The voice was both comforting and chilling, familiar and foreign, as though it had been calling her for eternity. She froze. It was him again. The voice she had heard in the letter, the one that had haunted her every step since she had first found those words. The voice of the forgotten lover. You've come back to me, Emily. You always will. Her heart skipped a beat. This was not the time for hesitation, not the time for doubts. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. She moved toward the chest, her footsteps heavy, each one a step closer to uncovering the truth. The air felt heavier with every passing second, the oppressive atmosphere threatening to swallow her whole. When she reached the chest, her fingers trembled as she reached for the latch. The cold metal seemed to burn her skin, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Not now. She lifted the lid. Inside, it was filled with old, brittle papers. Letters, photographs, memories of a past she hadn't lived. The smell of aged paper filled her nostrils as she sifted through the pile, her hands shaking as she pulled out a letter. This one was different from the others. It wasn't written in the same neat handwriting, but instead, it was a hasty scrawl, almost frantic in its urgency. She read the first few lines aloud, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to uncover. Emily, you are the only one who can stop him. You are the only one who can break the curse that binds me to this house. He is watching you. You must not trust the mirror. It lies. The words felt like they were burning into her skin. He is watching you. The realization hit her like a brick. All along, he had been right there, following her every step, manipulating her every move. But who was he? What did he want from her? Before she could gather her thoughts, the voice spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. Don't you see, Emily? It's already too late. You can't leave me. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned around, looking for the source of the voice. The attic was now fully alive with shadows, the air thick with the scent of decay. The walls seemed to be closing in around her, the floor beneath her feet shifting, warping. It's you, she whispered, her voice a mere breath. The figure she had seen in the reflection, the shadowy figure, emerged from the darkness, moving toward her with an unnatural, fluid grace. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, cold and piercing, as if they could see straight through her soul. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice low and filled with malice. You think you can escape? You think you can undo the past? I won't let you. You belong to me now, Emily. Forever. Her breath caught in her throat. The darkness around her pressed in. But this time, it wasn't just the house closing in on her. It was the past, the cursed love, the forgotten lover that was claiming her, pulling her down into its suffocating depths. No, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I won't let you do this. I will end this. But as the words left her lips, the attic began to shake violently, the walls groaning under the weight of something ancient and powerful. The mirror at the far end of the room cracked, splintering into 1,000 shards that rained down around her, each piece reflecting the same tortured face. Her own face, a face she no longer recognized. In the chaos, the figure stepped closer, his glowing eyes never leaving her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was trapped. The past had caught up with her, and it wasn't going to let go. Don't you want to know the truth? He asked, his voice echoing in the room, vibrating through her bones. The truth about who I am, about why I'm here, about why you're here. Before she could answer, the room plunged into darkness, complete and utter darkness. The last thing she heard was his voice, soft and haunting, just before the silence consumed her completely. You've always known, Emily. The truth was never hidden from you. You were always meant to find me. Emily's consciousness flickered in and out of reality. One moment, she felt like she was drifting in an endless void, and the next, she was standing once again in the attic. The darkness around her had settled, but something about it felt different now. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows, oh, the shadows were alive. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she forced herself to take a step forward. The ground felt like it was shifting under her feet, as though the very foundation of the house had begun to crumble. She reached out instinctively for something to steady herself, her hand finding the rough surface of the wall. The old wood groaned under her touch, as though the house itself was alive and in agony. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. Emily, the voice, that voice. Her blood ran cold. The figure, the man who had been tormenting her for so long. He was here, just as he had promised. She spun around, her heart thundering in her chest, and there he was, the figure she had seen countless times in her reflections. The same glowing eyes, the same haunting face. His features were blurred, shifting, as if he weren't truly human. He was more like a shadow, an apparition, a memory that had refused to die. But this time he was different. His form was clearer, more solid, and in his hand he held something familiar, a letter, Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. The letter she had found. The one from the beginning. The one that had drawn her into this nightmare in the first place. "You've read it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You've read my letters, and now you understand. You know what I want. What I've always wanted." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was a whirlpool of confusion, her body paralyzed by the terror that had gripped her heart. "You can't run from me," he continued, stepping closer. "Not anymore. It's too late for that. You were never meant to leave this house. You were meant to stay with me, forever." As he spoke, his form seemed to become more and more corporeal, more real. He was no longer just a shadow, a figment of her imagination. He was here, and he was angry. His glowing eyes bore into her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing on her soul. Emily stepped back, her breath quickening, but the figure followed, his movements fluid and unnatural. She had to get out of here. She had to escape. But as she turned to run, something stopped her. The mirror. It stood at the far end of the room, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness. But it wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a window into the past, a window into the truth she had been avoiding. Her reflection was distorted, twisted. She saw herself older, broken, lost. And in the reflection, standing beside her, was the figure. His face was clearer now, the lines sharper. He wasn't just a lover. He was something darker, something far more dangerous. Suddenly, the truth hit her like a thunderclap. The man wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a spirit that had been haunting the house. He was something much worse. He was a part of the house itself, a curse that had bound him to this place for eternity. And Emily had been drawn into his trap, just as every occupant before her had been. "You were always meant to find me, Emily," he whispered, his voice now soft, almost tender. "It's in your blood. The house calls to you. You can't escape it. You can't escape me." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She had never been free. The love letters, the strange pull she had felt to the house, it had all been leading her to this moment. She was a part of the house's curse, a part of his curse. But there was one thing she hadn't understood until now. The letters, the warnings, the whispered promises. They weren't meant for her. They were meant for someone else. Someone who had lived here before. Someone who had been lost to the curse. Emily's heart stopped. She was the one who had been forgotten. "You see now, don't you?" The figure's voice was full of bitter satisfaction. "You were never supposed to leave. You were always meant to be mine. And now you're just like them, just like all the others who came before you." Her eyes flicked to the letter he was still holding, her fingers aching to touch it, to understand. But it wasn't the same letter. This one was different, older, faded. It wasn't hers, but it was the key. It was the letter she had never seen, the one that explained everything. With trembling hands, she reached for it, her mind racing. She had to know. She had to understand the truth. As she took the letter from his hand, the room seemed to shift. The shadows stretched farther. The air grew colder. Her body felt heavy as the curse closed in around her. The figure grinned as he watched her read, and his voice echoed through the attic. "Now you understand. You can never leave, Emily. You will stay with me forever." And then everything went black.